Okay, here, this is Sean McComb, Teacher Laureate, the teaching channel. Just running through how, for this quarter, I planned to customize instruction for students and how the process worked for us and kind of how we thought about it strategically to be able to respond to students, and you might be able to do the same. So I'll run through the kind of generic process and then an example. So within a period of instruction, we analyzed the summative assessment. And we looked for areas of key knowledge and skills, and then we looked at the standards and really dug into the standards and read deep down into them to really see what constitutes a standard and make sure that we were familiar with that going forward. Then based on that, we chunked the learning and planned learning checks in order to have some discrete pieces of learning that we wanted to instruct on, and then check that learning. Instruct on this next chunk of learning, and then check it. Instruct on this next chunk of learning, and then check it, until we got up to that summative assessment. So the key was kind of taking that assessment apart and chunking that learning. What was some interesting learning for me was around this idea of what the learning check could be or how it could look, and that it could be written with intentionality to define some specific strengths and deficits for kids. So that might be, for me it was taking a pretty complex standard, 10th grade standards for characterization and theme, and really breaking them down into their elements. It might be giving kids a few different questions and answer possibilities to try to identify where their error occurred, so that then you could think about addressing kids' needs that way. The key here is that writing the assessment this way should help produce groups of like need, so that then the teacher can work with specific groups following that. So that during the chunk of learning that follows that check, teacher can pull those groups based on what the learning check or what that formative assessment, that piece of formative assessment process tells the teacher the students need. So that's taking papers. I took students' papers and just started making piles with kids who had patterns of errors. So what did this look like, in practice for me? Here was the prompt that my students would have to write to as their summative assessment for the first half of our fourth quarter unit. So they read the play A Doll's House, and the prompt asked them to choose a character who responds to a cultural collision, then write a well-organized essay in which they describe the character's response to the collision and explain his or her relevance to the work as a whole. So a pretty hefty prompt, asking kids to do a lot here. We had to think about, okay, break this down and what does it mean? So for us it meant, responding to a cultural collision meant that we need to, make sure that kids understood what that looked like in literature, and maybe we would transfer that skill with another short story and bring it back to their analysis of A Doll's House. Describe the character's response, so we needed to look at character growth and characterization throughout the play and our analysis of the play. And then the relevance to the work as a whole spoke to theme, right, and the author's message throughout the text. So those became our three key areas of instruction, and then they would be followed by learning checks. So key instruction on characterization, kids working on tasks that ask them to do that work, and then strategic learning check there. Instruction on theme, strategic learning check there. Instruction on cultural collision, and then summative assessment. So then we dug into that standard for characterization, and we broke that down. So elements of characterization were about development over the course of the text, interaction with other characters, and how does that character's growth advance the plot or develop the theme. So those were the three elements that students really need to have a deep understanding of at this point in order to be successful down the road here. So then when we spent 2 or 3 days working through the play on characterization, character development, then moved on to new learning and theme. But while this new learning was happening, I had looked at these learning checks on characterization, and we in these class periods would do new learning on theme and keep moving forward But then when students would go to do their independent work, I would pool different groups of students based on their need for characterization. So across this period of time, these were 3 block periods for me, and pooled kids based on their needs identified from this characterization learning check. What this looked like was pretty straightforward. I didn't want to trip kids up or confuse them, so the prompt basically asked them to analyze a character's growth and gave them these 3 avenues for analysis. And then I was looking for strengths and weaknesses in the way that they adapted that, and then formed groups of kids based on that. What was, some new learning for me that my colleagues helped me see was that, I was thinking, gosh, I have to cover new learning and get to all 3 groups in a single class period. That was my misconception at first. But instead, they said think across those 3 class periods and try to see each of those 3 groups twice. So maybe on the first day, I see the group for development and interactions, but I don't see the group that's looking to had trouble with how the characterization advances the plot. But I make sure I start with them the next day, and then I circle back to the kids who needed some help with development. And maybe some of these kids from development, had moved up into a different group, or they didn't need additional support in that on the next day. And then on the third day, have another chance to get the kids who needed support with advancing the plot, and the kids who worked with interaction with other characters. And experiencing this assessment, sometimes it was that kids, it looked like they needed interactions and advancing the plot, but they had some knowledge about interaction with their characters. They didn't put it in their learning check, but on this day when I met with them, it was clear that they had it. And so they were able to move on to advancing the plot or developing theme if that was a deficit that they had, or they were solid on that standard, and I didn't need to meet with them in a small group again. So then after those days instructing with theme and pulling those small groups, a learning check on theme. That standard broke down into these elements, and then that would form some of these groups. I merged 2 of them, the shaping and emerging, with just the reference to specific details. And then, one possibility is that after looking at it, doesn't break down cleanly into what the standard happens to anticipate the students need. For theme, the way it worked out in my class was that I had students who knocked both of these out of the park, and they were solid on theme, and they saw it, and they were good. And so this other group for me turned out to be kids who had really showed mastery of theme, and instead, when I met with them, I was able to work with them on reading a piece of literary criticism about A Doll's House and analyzing that author's perspective and that analysis, and how that could further our understanding. And we did that. I pulled those groups while we were reading some short stories that had cultural collision at their heart to also prepare us for the summative assessment.